The service passed in a blur of hymns Dorothy had selected and readings from her favorite poetry collections. Ruth spoke about childhood memories. Paul shared stories from their camping trips to the family cabin at Mount Hood. And Mrs. Henderson read a letter from one of Dorothy's former students, who'd become a teacher herself, inspired by the librarian who'd helped her discover a love of learning. Each tribute painted a picture of a woman who'd spent her life nurturing others, who'd believed in potential even when it seemed absent, who'd given freely of her time and heart to anyone who needed guidance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat in the front pew, nodding at appropriate moments, accepting condolences from people who squeezed my hand or whispered kind words about Dorothy's impact on their lives. But my mind kept drifting to Brian's voice echoing across a golf course, to his casual dismissal of everything these people were celebrating. The contrast felt surreal, like watching a documentary about someone else's family while living inside a nightmare version of my own. After the chapel service, we moved outside for the burial. The November rain had softened to a gentle mist that seemed fitting for Dorothy's gentle spirit, but it also reminded me of all the storms she'd weathered with quiet strength. The cemetery workers had positioned chairs around the gravesite, and I watched as family members took their seats, still glancing toward the parking area as if Brian might materialize at the last moment, fashionably late but appropriately apologetic. He didn't, of course. While the pastor offered final prayers and we each dropped a handful of earth onto Dorothy's casket, my son was probably calculating his scorecard and planning dinner at some expensive resort restaurant. The finality of that moment, watching Dorothy disappear beneath the ground while her child played games 3 states away, crystallized something inside me that had been building for years. Frank approached as the crowd began to disperse, his hands deep in the pockets of his dark wool coat. "That was beautiful, Harold. Dorothy would have been proud of how many people came to honor her." "She would have been proud of most of it," I replied, my voice carrying a bitterness I hadn't intended to reveal. Frank nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what I hadn't said directly. We walked together toward the parking area, our feet crunching on wet gravel, the sound mixing with quiet conversations as other mourners made their way back to their lives. Ruth caught up with us near my pickup truck, her nephew Paul beside her. She'd been crying steadily throughout the service, but her eyes held a different kind of sadness now, something sharper and more focused. "Harold," I kept looking for Brian. Paul said he thought he saw him near the back of the chapel, but I never spotted him. The lie would have been easy. Traffic from California could be terrible, especially with the weather. Business emergency that couldn't be avoided. Important client meeting that had been scheduled months ago. Dorothy had always made excuses for Brian's absences, smoothing over family tensions with creative explanations that preserved his reputation while protecting my feelings. But standing beside Dorothy's fresh grave, surrounded by people who'd honored her memory with their presence, I couldn't bring myself to continue that pattern. Ruth deserved the truth. Paul deserved to understand why his cousin had valued golf over family obligations. "He's not here, Ruth. He chose to attend a golf tournament instead. Said it was more important for his career than his mother's funeral." The silence that followed felt heavy with more than grief. Ruth's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to disbelief, then hardening into something I'd never seen from Dorothy's gentle sister. Paul's jaw tightened, his hands forming fists at his sides. "A golf tournament," Ruth repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the day we buried Dorothy." I nodded, watching the understanding settle over both of them. These were people who'd canceled their own obligations, traveled through dangerous weather, rearranged their lives to ensure Dorothy received the farewell she deserved.
The concept of choosing recreation over respect was foreign to their understanding of family loyalty. Paul spoke for the first time since the service ended, his voice tight with controlled anger. Aunt Dorothy used to brag about Brian's success, his promotions, his fancy apartment in San Francisco. She made it sound like he was building something important, something that would make the family proud. Frank stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "Harold, I've been thinking about what you told me earlier, about Brian's priorities. Maybe it's time to consider whether Dorothy's final wishes need some adjustment." The suggestion hung in the air between us, unspoken but clearly understood. Dorothy had spent her final weeks updating her will, carefully dividing her possessions and investments to ensure Brian would be comfortable after her death. The cabin at Mount Hood, the one where Paul had spent countless childhood summers learning to fish and hike, was designated specifically for Brian, despite his absence from family gatherings for the past 5 years. Ruth wiped her eyes with a tissue that had seen considerable use throughout the day. "I remember when Dorothy was updating her will last month. She called me all excited about leaving Brian the cabin, said it would give him a reason to stay connected to the family, said maybe having that responsibility would help him remember what matters." The irony was painful. Dorothy had believed that giving Brian ownership of our family's most treasured gathering place would inspire him to value family connections. Instead, he demonstrated that no amount of inheritance could purchase genuine care or respect. The cabin would simply become another asset he'd either sell for profit or ignore until it required maintenance he'd be too busy to handle. Paul's voice carried the frustration of someone who'd loved both his aunt and his cousin, but had watched only one of them reciprocate that affection. "I spent every summer at that cabin from age 8 to 18. Uncle Harold taught me to use power tools in the workshop out back. Aunt Dorothy and I would sit on the porch reading books together every evening after dinner. That place is sacred to our family's memory. But it's going to Brian, who hasn't visited the cabin once in the past 3 years, who missed the last 2 family reunions because he had work conferences, who couldn't even show up to bury the woman who loved him most in the world." Frank cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to practical matters. "Harold, I don't want to speak out of turn, but Dorothy mentioned to my wife that she was having second thoughts about some of her decisions. Said she was worried Brian had gotten too focused on his career, too disconnected from family values." The revelation surprised me. Dorothy had never expressed doubts about Brian directly to me, always maintaining her faith in his eventual maturation. But she'd confided her concerns to Frank's wife Martha during their weekly coffee meetings, admitting fears she'd protected me from hearing. "She was planning to talk with you about possibly revising the will again," Frank continued. "Martha said Dorothy wanted to wait until after Brian's next visit to see if he'd show more interest in family connections. She never got that chance." The weight of missed opportunities settled over our small group. Dorothy had died hoping for one more chance to assess Brian's character, one more visit where she could gauge whether her son had grown into someone worthy of carrying forward the family legacy she'd worked so hard to preserve. Ruth looked toward the cemetery office building, where lights were beginning to come on against the gray afternoon. "Harold, Dorothy may not have had the chance to revise her will, but you do. You're still alive. You still have choices to make about how your own estate gets distributed."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The suggestion was direct, but gentle, acknowledging the complexity of the situation without pushing me toward any specific decision. But the seed was planted, growing stronger with each memory of Brian's casual dismissal of everything Dorothy had represented. Paul stepped closer, his young face serious with the kind of determination that reminded me of myself at his age.
Uncle Harold, I know it's not my place to say this, but somebody needs to. Brian treated Aunt Dorothy like an inconvenience for the last 5 years of her life. He treated you both like obligations he managed rather than parents he loved. Today proved that death doesn't change someone's priorities, it just reveals them. The truth in his words was undeniable. I'd spent years making excuses for Brian's behavior, telling myself he was just busy establishing his career, just focused on building financial security for his own family. But successful people manage to maintain family relationships while pursuing professional goals. Caring people found ways to show love even during demanding periods. Brian had chosen differently, consistently and deliberately, until his absence from our lives became more normal than his presence. Frank checked his watch, a gesture that reminded me the day was advancing toward evening, toward the quiet hours when grief would settle into the space Brian's presence should have occupied. Harold, Martha has dinner waiting at our house. Why don't you join us? You shouldn't be alone tonight. The invitation was kind, but I felt drawn toward solitude, toward the house Dorothy and I had shared for 28 years, toward the quiet space where I could process what this day had revealed about my son's character. I need some time to think, Frank, but thank you for everything, for being here, for speaking truth, for understanding what Dorothy meant to all of us. Ruth hugged me goodbye, her embrace carrying decades of family connection and shared loss. Take care of yourself, Harold. Dorothy would want you to find peace, not just grief. As they walked toward their cars, I remained beside my pickup truck for several more minutes, looking back toward the cemetery where Dorothy's grave was now marked only by flowers and the fresh earth that would eventually settle and be covered with grass. The finality of burial was supposed to bring closure, but all I felt was the opening of questions I'd avoided confronting while she was alive. How long had Dorothy known that Brian was slipping away from us? How many excuses had she made privately while maintaining public faith in his eventual return to family values? How much disappointment had she carried silently, protecting me from the truth about our son's indifference? The drive home took me through neighborhoods where Dorothy and I had built our life together, past Jefferson Elementary, where she'd shaped young minds for 3 decades, through the downtown area where we'd shopped for groceries and attended community events, and lived the quiet, meaningful existence that Brian had outgrown. Our Craftsman house in Laurelhurst looked smaller somehow when I pulled into the driveway, as if Dorothy's absence had compressed its dimensions. The porch light was on, triggered by the timer she'd set to welcome us home each evening. Her rose garden lay dormant under the gray sky, waiting for spring to reveal whether the plants would survive their first winter without her careful tending. Inside, the house greeted me with familiar smells and sounds, the subtle creaking of old wood settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the mantel clock Dorothy had inherited from her mother. But underneath those comforting constants was something new, a silence that felt permanent rather than temporary. I made coffee without thinking, muscle memory guiding my hands through the routine Dorothy and I had shared every morning for decades. Only when I reached for 2 mugs did the reality hit me again, the physical reminder that half of my daily rituals were now performed alone. In Dorothy's reading chair, surrounded by the books she'd been working through during her final weeks, I found a legal pad covered with her handwriting, notes about the will revision she'd been considering, questions she'd wanted to discuss with our lawyer, concerns about whether her distribution of assets reflected her true hopes for our family's future. The last entry, dated just 3 days before her death, was underlined twice. What kind of man will Brian become if he inherits everything without earning any of it? Dorothy had seen the truth about our son more clearly than I'd realized. Her motherly love hadn't blinded her to his selfishness, it had simply motivated her to keep hoping for change that never came. But hope without evidence becomes enabling, and enabling without consequences teaches all the wrong lessons. I reached for the phone and dialed our family lawyer's number, knowing Gerald Hutchinson often worked late, especially when clients needed guidance during difficult transitions. His secretary put me through immediately, her voice gentle with the sympathy reserved for recent widowers. "Harold, I was so sorry to hear about Dorothy. She was a remarkable woman, and I know this must be incredibly difficult for you." His voice carried the warmth of professional relationships that had evolved into genuine friendship over the years we'd worked together on estate planning. "Thank you, Gerald. The funeral was today, and it revealed some things about my family that I need to discuss with you. I want to revise my own will, possibly Dorothy's as well, if that's still possible." "Of course. When would you like to meet? I have some time tomorrow afternoon, if that works for you." "Tomorrow afternoon would be perfect. And Gerald, I think it's time my son learned that inheritance is a privilege that has to be earned, not a right that's guaranteed by biology." The appointment was scheduled, the first step toward ensuring that Dorothy's legacy would be honored by people who'd actually honored her memory. Brian had chosen golf over goodbye. Soon he'd discover that some choices echo far longer than 18 holes. Gerald Hutchinson's law office occupied the third floor of a restored brick building in downtown Portland, its tall windows overlooking the Willamette River. I'd been coming here for 20 years, first to draft wills when Dorothy and I were young and optimistic about our future, later to update documents as Brian grew older and our expectations evolved. Now I sat in the familiar leather chair across from Gerald's mahogany desk, surrounded by law books and framed diplomas that represented decades of helping families navigate their most difficult decisions. Gerald poured coffee from a silver service that had belonged to his grandfather, another lawyer who'd built his practice on discretion and careful counsel. The ritual felt comforting in its formality, a reminder that some conversations required the weight of tradition and proper procedure. Steam rose from the delicate china cups as Gerald settled behind his desk, his expression professionally neutral but touched with genuine concern. "I've pulled both your file and Dorothy's," he said, gesturing toward two thick folders positioned between us. "Her will was finalized just 6 weeks ago, and as I recall, she was very specific about her intentions regarding the Mount Hood cabin and her other assets. She wanted to ensure Brian would have financial security and a connection to family traditions." The memory of that conversation was still fresh. Dorothy had insisted on walking to Gerald's office despite her weakening condition, determined to handle her final arrangements with dignity and purpose. She'd spoken passionately about the Mount Hood cabin, about her hope that inheriting it would inspire Brian to value family gatherings and create new memories with his own children someday. She was operating under certain assumptions about Brian's character, I said carefully. Yesterday's events have caused me to reevaluate those assumptions. Gerald nodded, his pen poised over a legal pad. "Why don't you tell me what happened, Harold? I need to understand your concerns before we discuss any potential changes."
The words came easier than I'd expected, perhaps because Gerald had known our family for decades, had witnessed Brian's transformation from an engaged child to an increasingly distant adult. I described the repeated phone calls, the golf course sounds in the background. Brian's casual dismissal of his mother's funeral is less important than networking opportunities. Gerald listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When I finished, Gerald set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "In my 40 years of practice, I've seen many family disputes over inheritance. Most involve greed or sibling rivalry or misunderstandings about a deceased person's intentions. This is different. This is about character, about whether someone has demonstrated the qualities necessary to honor a legacy." He opened Dorothy's file and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the desk like evidence in a trial. Dorothy left Brian the cabin, her teacher's retirement account, and half of her personal investments. The total value is approximately $400,000.
She also specified that he should receive her collection of first-edition children's books, hoping he might donate them to libraries in her memory. The irony was painful. Dorothy had chosen gifts that reflected her values, assets that carried emotional significance beyond their financial worth. The cabin represented family connection, the books symbolized her commitment to education, the investments reflected her frugal wisdom in preparing for the future. She'd assumed Brian would treasure these gifts for their deeper meaning, not just their monetary value. Gerald continued reading from her will. She also included a letter to be delivered with the inheritance documents, explaining her hopes that Brian would use these assets to strengthen family bonds and honor the values she'd tried to instill in him. She wanted him to host family reunions at the cabin, to ensure her books reached children who needed them, to remember that wealth carries responsibility. The letter would be a final blow, Dorothy's gentle words expressing faith in the son who'd chosen golf over her farewell. Brian would receive her loving message along with assets he'd never deserved, gifts from a woman whose death he'd treated as an inconvenience. What are my options, Gerald? Can Dorothy's will be contested or modified? Gerald consulted a thick legal reference book, his finger tracing relevant statutes. Oregon law does allow for will modifications under specific circumstances, particularly when new evidence emerges about beneficiary behavior that conflicts with the deceased's stated intentions. Since Dorothy specifically mentioned wanting Brian to honor family values and maintain connections, his absence from her funeral could constitute grounds for reevaluation. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching potential alternatives. We could argue that Dorothy's bequests were conditional upon Brian demonstrating the character traits she valued. His failure to attend her funeral suggests he lacks the respect and commitment she expected from her beneficiaries. The legal framework was encouraging, but I wanted to understand the practical implications. What would happen to Dorothy's assets if we successfully modify her will? There are several options. The assets could revert to you as her surviving spouse, be redistributed to other family members who've demonstrated appropriate values, or be donated to charities that reflect Dorothy's priorities. Many people choose a combination approach, ensuring worthy family members are recognized while supporting causes the deceased cared about. The mention of worthy family members brought Paul to mind. Ruth's son had driven through dangerous weather to honor Dorothy's memory, had spent countless childhood summers learning family traditions at the cabin, had maintained genuine relationships with both of us throughout his adult life. If anyone deserved to inherit Dorothy's hopes for family connection, it was Paul. "What about my own will?" I asked.
"I want to ensure my decisions reflect the lessons Brian learned yesterday." Gerald opened the second file, revealing documents Dorothy and I had crafted together during happier times, when we had assumed our son would mature into someone worthy of our trust. Your current will leaves everything to Brian, with small bequests to charity and other family members. Given his demonstrated priorities, we might want to reconsider that distribution. The conversation was interrupted by Gerald's secretary, announcing an urgent phone call. He apologized and stepped into the outer office, leaving me alone with the documents that represented our family's financial history. Dorothy's teacher's salary statements, investment records showing decades of careful saving, property deeds for the cabin we'd purchased when Brian was 12 and still enjoyed family vacations. Looking at those papers, I remembered the summers we'd spent at Mount Hood, teaching Brian to fish in the creek that ran beside the cabin, watching him learn to identify different bird species from Dorothy's field guides, listening to him read aloud on the porch while evening settled over the forest. That child had grown into a man who valued golf partnerships more than family relationships, who measured success in corporate promotions rather than meaningful connections. Gerald returned with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, Harold. That was another client dealing with a similar family situation. Unfortunately, stories like yours are becoming more common. Adult children who've lost sight of the values their parents tried to teach them." He settled behind his desk again, pulling out a calculator and several forms. "Let's discuss specifics. If we modify Dorothy's will, I'd recommend moving the cabin to Paul, who's actually maintained relationships with family members and visited regularly. The financial assets could be split between deserving relatives and charities Dorothy supported, particularly literacy programs and educational foundations. The suggestion felt right, honoring Dorothy's values while recognizing people who'd actually demonstrated those values in their behavior. Paul would treasure the cabin and use it to maintain family traditions. Educational charities would continue Dorothy's work helping children discover the joy of learning. "What about Brian's reaction?" I asked. "He'll be expecting a significant inheritance, and he'll certainly contest any changes." Gerald's expression hardened slightly. "Let him contest it. We'll have documentation of his absence from his mother's funeral, witness statements about his stated priorities, evidence that he failed to maintain the family relationships Dorothy valued. Oregon courts take testamentary intent seriously. If we can prove Dorothy's bequests were based on assumptions about Brian's character that his behavior has proven false, we have a strong case." The legal confidence was reassuring, but the emotional implications were more complex. Modifying Dorothy's will meant acknowledging that her faith in Brian had been misplaced, that her hope for his eventual maturation had died with her. It meant accepting that love wasn't enough to transform someone who'd chosen selfishness over family loyalty. "There's another consideration," Gerald continued. "Your own will should be updated to reflect current realities. If something happens to you next month, do you want Brian to inherit assets he's proven he doesn't value? Do you want him to sell the family home, liquidate investments Dorothy helped accumulate, treat your life's work as nothing more than windfall profits?" The question struck deep. Dorothy and I had built our estate through decades of careful planning, modest living, and shared sacrifice. We'd assumed Brian would honor that legacy, would understand that inherited wealth carried responsibility to family and community. Instead, he demonstrated that our assets would become nothing more than additional funding for his selfish pursuits. "I want to change both wills," I said firmly. "Dorothy's, because her intentions were based on false assumptions about Brian's character, and mine because I won't reward the behavior he displayed yesterday."
Gerald began pulling forms from his desk drawer, the paperwork required to undo decades of misplaced faith. "We'll need to move quickly on Dorothy's will. Oregon law requires modifications to be filed within 6 months of death, and we want to complete the process before Brian learns about potential changes and tries to interfere." The timeline added urgency to our planning. Brian was probably still celebrating his golf tournament victory, unaware that his absence from Dorothy's funeral had cost him $400,000 and the family legacy he'd taken for granted. His ignorance wouldn't last forever, though. Eventually, he'd contact Gerald's office requesting information about his inheritance, and the truth would emerge. "How long will this process take?" I asked. "If we work efficiently, we can have modified wills completed within 2 weeks. The legal requirements are straightforward when the surviving spouse initiates changes, especially when there's clear evidence that the deceased's intentions were based on incorrect assumptions about beneficiary character." Gerald spread several forms across the desk, each requiring careful consideration of how our family's assets should be distributed. The cabin would go to Paul, who'd actually earned it through years of respectful relationships. Dorothy's retirement funds would support the literacy programs she'd championed throughout her career. Her book collection would go to Jefferson Elementary, where former students could benefit from her literary treasures. "What remains," Gerald asked, "is determining how to handle Brian's notification. Do you want him to learn about the changes gradually, or would you prefer a direct conversation?" The question required careful thought. Brian would react with fury regardless of how he learned the truth, but he deserved to understand the connection between his choices and their consequences. A letter explaining the modifications would preserve the educational value of the situation while protecting me from his initial emotional explosion. I'd like to write him a letter explaining my decisions, something he can read privately and consider carefully before responding. He needs to understand that his inheritance wasn't eliminated out of spite, but redirected toward people who've actually demonstrated the values Dorothy and I tried to teach him. Gerald nodded approvingly. That's wise, Harold. Documentation of your reasoning will also strengthen our legal position if Brian chooses to challenge these changes in court. The letter should explain specific examples of behavior that influenced your decisions, making it clear that his inheritance was conditional upon demonstrating appropriate character. As we worked through the paperwork, I felt something shifting inside me. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of justice being served, of consequences finally catching up with choices that had been evaded too long. Dorothy had spent her final years making excuses for Brian's selfishness, protecting him from the natural results of his behavior. That protection had died with her. Brian was about to discover that some lessons could only be learned through loss, that family loyalty was a privilege that required maintenance, and that inheritance was an honor reserved for people who'd proven themselves worthy of carrying forward a legacy they actually respected. The documents were signed, witnessed, and notarized by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Dorothy's modified will and my updated estate plan were filed with the appropriate courts, creating a legal reality that reflected our family's actual dynamics rather than our outdated hopes. Tomorrow I would write the letter that would teach my son the most important lesson Dorothy had never been able to deliver. The letter took 3 drafts to get right. I sat at Dorothy's writing desk using her favorite fountain pen to craft words that would fundamentally alter my son's understanding of consequences and inheritance. The first version had been too emotional, filled with the raw hurt of his betrayal. The second had been too harsh, focused on punishment rather than education. The third struck the right balance between disappointment and hope, explaining my decisions while leaving room for potential redemption. 10 days had passed since Dorothy's funeral. 10 days of peaceful mornings without worrying about Brian's next crisis or demand. I'd spent the time organizing Dorothy's belongings, tending her garden, and preparing for a life that no longer revolved around enabling someone who'd consistently chosen selfishness over family loyalty. The modified wills were legally finalized, the inheritance documents prepared, and the consequences ready to be delivered. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the manila envelope that also contained copies of both revised wills, Brian's disinheritance papers, and a cashier's check for $5,000. Not enough to maintain his lifestyle, but sufficient to demonstrate that my decision wasn't motivated by spite. He would receive something, just not the windfall he had assumed was his birthright. The certified mail receipt required Brian's signature, ensuring he couldn't claim ignorance of the contents. I walked to the post office through neighborhoods where Dorothy and I had raised our family, past playgrounds where Brian had once played happily, through communities where values like respect and responsibility still mattered to most parents. The postal clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, processed the certified mail with professional efficiency. "This is going to California?" she observed, reading the address. "Important documents?" "Life-changing ones," I replied, watching her affix the tracking labels that would monitor the letter's journey to Brian's San Francisco apartment. "Some lessons can only be learned through direct experience." She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd probably seen her share of family complications. "Sometimes that's the only way people grow up," she said, handing me the receipt. "Hope everything works out for the best." The letter would arrive within 3 business days, reaching Brian during a week when he'd probably forgotten about his mother's funeral entirely, moved on to new golf tournaments and networking opportunities. His comfortable routine was about to be permanently disrupted by the delayed consequences of choices he'd made without considering their long-term implications. I spent those 3 days in productive solitude, continuing projects Dorothy had started, planning the European trip she'd always dreamed about, researching volunteer opportunities that would honor her commitment to education and literacy. For the first time in years, my schedule belonged entirely to me, free from the constant anticipation of Brian's next financial emergency or emotional crisis. The phone rang at precisely 2:30 on Thursday afternoon, exactly 72 hours after the letter's scheduled delivery. Brian's name appeared on the caller ID, followed immediately by Jessica's number, then Brian's work line. I let all 3 calls go to voicemail, curious to hear his initial reaction but not ready for direct confrontation. The first message was pure shock. "Dad, what the hell is this letter? You can't be serious about this inheritance stuff. Call me back immediately. We need to talk about this insanity." The second message revealed growing panic. "Dad, I just got off the phone with that lawyer, Gerald, what's his name? He confirmed everything in your letter. This is completely unfair. I had legitimate business obligations. You can't punish me for building my career." The third message descended into desperate bargaining. "Look, I know I made mistakes with Mom's funeral, but we can work this out. I'll visit more often, I'll call every week, whatever you want. Just don't do this to me. To us." "Jessica's pregnant, Dad. We need that inheritance money for our future." Jessica's pregnancy was news to me, information Brian had apparently forgotten to share during our last conversation about his important golf tournament. The irony was striking. He'd missed his mother's funeral to focus on his career, but now wanted family money to support the family he'd failed to prioritize when it mattered most. I listened to the messages twice, noting the progression from outrage to panic to manipulation. No genuine remorse for missing Dorothy's funeral, no acknowledgement of the pain his absence had caused, no recognition that his behavior had violated basic standards of family loyalty. Just anger that consequences had finally arrived to disrupt his comfortable assumptions. The phone rang again, an hour later. This time I answered, curious to hear how Brian would approach direct conversation now that the legal reality had been confirmed. "Dad, thank God you finally picked up." His voice carried a strained cheerfulness, the tone he'd used as a teenager when caught in misbehavior, but still hoping to charm his way out of trouble. "We need to talk about this misunderstanding with Mom's will and your inheritance plans." "It's not a misunderstanding, Brian," I said calmly, settling into Dorothy's reading chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped enabling destructive behavior. "Your inheritance was conditional on demonstrating the values your mother and I tried to teach you. Your absence from her funeral proved you lack those values." "That's not fair, Dad. I had legitimate business reasons for missing the funeral. This golf tournament was arranged months in advance, with clients who'd flown in specifically to meet with me. I couldn't just abandon my professional obligations." The same excuse he'd used a week ago, repeated with the expectation that professional advancement justified personal abandonment. "But you could abandon your family obligations," I replied. "You could abandon your dying mother's hope that her son would say goodbye. You could abandon basic respect for the woman who gave you life." A pause filled with the sound of Brian's rapid breathing. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. "Dad, you're being emotional about this. Mom's dead. Standing around crying at her funeral wouldn't have changed anything. But this inheritance decision will destroy my family's financial security." The casual dismissal of Dorothy's death, reduced to standing around crying, revealed everything I needed to know about Brian's character development. He'd learned to excel at professional presentations and golf course networking, but he'd never learned to value the relationships that had made his success possible. "Your mother spent her final months revising her will," I continued, "because she hoped leaving you the family cabin would inspire you to maintain connections with relatives who actually cared about her memory. She died believing you'd use that inheritance to honor her values and strengthen family bonds." "I can still do that," Brian interrupted, his voice climbing toward panic. "I'll host family reunions at the cabin. I'll visit more often. I'll be the son you want me to be. Just don't take away my inheritance over one mistake." One mistake. Missing your mother's funeral wasn't an isolated error in judgment, Brian. It was the culmination of years of choosing convenience over commitment, Success over service. Personal advancement over family loyalty. Your mother made excuses for your behavior until the day she died, but I won't continue that pattern. The silence stretched longer this time. I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, asking questions Brian wasn't ready to answer. The comfortable life they'd built on assumptions about inherited wealth was crumbling, and they were both beginning to understand the magnitude of consequences they'd never considered possible. "What about my children, Dad? Jessica's pregnant with our first baby. That inheritance money was going to pay for private schools, college funds, the kind of opportunities every parent wants to provide." The revelation of grandchildren should have softened my resolve, but instead it strengthened it. What kind of father would Brian become if he never learned accountability for his choices? What values would he pass to children whose financial security depended on inherited wealth rather than earned success? "Congratulations on the pregnancy," I said genuinely. "Your mother would have been thrilled about becoming a grandmother. She would have wanted to help with the baby, to share her experience and wisdom, to create the kind of multi-generational relationships that make families strong. She would have, if she'd lived long enough to see her grandchild born. But she died hoping her son would visit, hoping he'd call, hoping he'd show up when she needed him most. Instead, you showed up for golf." "Dad, please." Brian's voice cracked with the strain of facing consequences he'd spent decades avoiding. "I know I wasn't perfect, but you can't destroy my future over past mistakes. I'll change. I'll be better. Just give me another chance." "I've given you chances for 30 years, Brian. Your mother gave you chances until her dying breath. We've covered for your mistakes, made excuses for your behavior, enabled your selfishness, because we hoped you'd eventually mature into someone worthy of our sacrifices. But worthiness isn't inherited, son. It's earned through choices that demonstrate character. You chose golf over your mother's funeral. Now you get to choose how to build a future without the financial safety net you took for granted." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, cycling through anger, bargaining, and desperate promises that Brian would somehow transform into the son we'd hoped he'd become. But character change required internal motivation, not external pressure. Real growth emerged from genuine remorse, not from fear of financial consequences. When he finally accepted that no amount of pleading would restore his inheritance, Brian's true nature emerged with startling clarity. "Fine, Dad. Keep your money. But don't expect me to pretend we're family anymore. Don't expect visits or phone calls or any relationship at all. You've chosen money over your son, just like you're accusing me of choosing career over family." The accusation would have stung if it contained any truth. But I hadn't chosen money over my son. I'd chosen accountability over enabling, consequences over comfort, the hope that loss might teach lessons that love had failed to impart. "Goodbye, Brian," I said quietly. "When you're ready to have an honest conversation about responsibility and respect, my door is still open. But your inheritance will remain with people who've actually demonstrated the values your mother tried to teach you." I hung up and immediately blocked his number, the same action he'd taken with me just 10 days earlier when his vacation was more important than family crisis. The symmetry felt appropriate, consequences reflecting choices with mathematical precision. The house settled into silence that felt different from the emptiness after Dorothy's death. This was the quiet of resolution rather than loss, the peace that comes from finally aligning actions with values, from ensuring that inheritance flows toward people who'd actually earned it through respectful behavior. Paul would receive the Mount Hood cabin and use it to maintain family traditions Brian had abandoned. Ruth would inherit Dorothy's retirement funds and honor her memory through charitable giving and family support. Educational foundations would benefit from assets that reflected Dorothy's lifelong commitment to helping children learn and grow. Brian would learn to build financial security through his own efforts, rather than inherited advantage, to value family relationships by maintaining them instead of assuming they'd survive neglect, to understand that some privileges required ongoing demonstration of worthiness. The phone sat silent on the table beside Dorothy's reading chair, no longer buzzing with crisis calls or manipulation attempts. Tomorrow, I would begin planning the European vacation Dorothy had dreamed about, using money that would honor her memory rather than enabling someone who dishonored it. Justice, I was learning, could be as peaceful as it was permanent. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of a Mediterranean cruise ship, watching the Greek coastline emerge from morning mist. Santorini's white buildings cascaded down volcanic cliffs like something from Dorothy's travel magazines, the ones she'd studied for years while dreaming of adventures we'd always postponed for more practical concerns.
Now, with $3,000 staying in my account each month instead of subsidizing Brian's lifestyle, those dreams had become achievable realities. The European vacation had exceeded every expectation Dorothy had harbored during her quiet moments of wanderlust. Rome's ancient forums, Paris museums filled with masterpieces she'd only seen in books, Mediterranean islands where azure waters met cloudless skies in perfect harmony. Each destination had felt like a gift to her memory, a belated fulfillment of promises we'd made to ourselves but never kept while enabling our ungrateful son. My cabin phone had rung twice during the 2-week voyage. Both times, the ship's communication system had displayed Brian's number. Both times, I'd declined the call without hesitation. Whatever crisis had motivated his attempts at contact would have to be resolved without my intervention, exactly as it should have been for years before Dorothy's death taught me the difference between love and enabling. The letters from Gerald Hutchinson had reached me at various ports, updates on legal proceedings that had unfolded exactly as predicted. Brian had contested both wills through expensive San Francisco attorneys, claiming emotional distress and undue influence, demanding restoration of his expected inheritance. Origin courts had rejected his challenges systematically, noting the clear documentation of his behavior and the rational connection between his choices and their consequences. Paul had taken possession of the Impt Hood cabin in April, immediately organizing the first family reunion in 5 years. Ruth's photographs had shown 3 generations gathered on the familiar porch, children learning to fish in the creek where Brian had once spent happy summers, adults sharing stories and maintaining connections he'd abandoned. The cabin was fulfilling Dorothy's hopes for family unity, just not in the way she'd originally envisioned. Jefferson Elementary had received Dorothy's first edition children's book collection with gratitude that touched my heart. The principal's thank you note had described plans for a special library section honoring Dorothy's memory, where her beloved books would continue inspiring young readers for generations to come. Her legacy was growing rather than gathering dust in storage units or being sold for quick profit. The Literacy Foundation, established with Dorothy's retirement funds, had already awarded scholarships to 12 students, enabling children from struggling families to attend summer reading programs and after-school tutoring sessions. Each scholarship recipient received a letter explaining that their opportunity existed because of a teacher who'd believed every child deserved access to education and enrichment. Dorothy's values were multiplying through people who shared her commitment to nurturing young minds. Frank Morrison had called regularly throughout my travels, providing updates on the house and garden, sharing neighborhood news, maintaining the friendship that had survived 40 decades of life's complications. His calls brought comfort without manipulation, connection without crisis, the kind of relationship Brian had never learned to sustain. "Harold, how's the Mediterranean treating you?" Frank's voice had carried across international phone lines during my stop in Barcelona, warm with genuine interest rather than hidden agendas. "Like Dorothy always imagined it would," I had replied, watching Spanish families enjoy evening meals together on restaurant patios. "She would have loved every minute of this adventure." "She's probably enjoying it through you," Frank had suggested, with the spiritual generosity that made our friendship valuable. "Maybe this trip is her way of showing you that life doesn't end when enabling does." The insight had resonated throughout my remaining travels. Dorothy's death had ended my role as Brian's financial safety net, but it had begun my rediscovery of personal interests, individual dreams, the satisfaction that comes from spending money on experiences rather than excuses. It was a debt I finally stopped paying. Finally. I'd been a husband and father for so long that I'd forgotten how to be simply Harold, a man with his own hopes and aspirations.
The cruise ship's daily newsletters had kept passengers informed about destinations and activities, but they'd also provided unexpected perspective on family dynamics. Other travelers shared stories during dinner conversations, retired couples finally pursuing adventures they'd postponed while raising children, grandparents learning to balance family generosity with personal boundaries, parents discovering that adult children sometimes needed to learn independence through experience rather than explanation. One evening, a retired teacher from Ohio had described her decision to stop funding her son's repeatedly failed business ventures. He'd been furious initially, she'd explained, but eventually started a successful consulting practice when family money was no longer available to cushion his mistakes. Sometimes love means letting people fall, she'd concluded, so they can learn to catch themselves. The wisdom had applied perfectly to my own situation. Brian's angry threats to cut off family contact had never materialized into actual action. Instead, he'd discovered that building financial security through personal effort was entirely possible when survival required it. Gerald's latest update had mentioned Brian's promotion to senior vice president, achieved through the professional focus that emerged when inherited wealth was no longer expected to subsidize lifestyle choices. Jessica had given birth to a healthy daughter in May, news that reached me through Ruth rather than direct communication. The baby's name was Dorothy, a gesture that suggested some recognition of family legacy even within ongoing estrangement. Perhaps grandparenthood would eventually inspire the maturity that inheritance couldn't motivate, though I'd stopped making predictions about Brian's character development. The ship's library had become my favorite retreat during sea days, a quiet space where I'd read books Dorothy had recommended, planned future adventures, written in the journal I'd started keeping to document this new phase of life. The entries reflected a contentment I hadn't experienced in years, the peace that comes from aligning actions with values, from ensuring that resources flow toward people who appreciate rather than expect them. My cabin steward, a young man from the Philippines who sent most of his earnings to support his family's education, had embodied the gratitude Brian had never learned to express. Miguel worked 16-hour days with genuine cheerfulness, treated every passenger interaction as an opportunity to provide excellent service, and spoke proudly of siblings whose college tuition depended on his sacrifice and dedication. The contrast had been illuminating. Miguel understood that family support was a privilege to be honored through respectful behavior, that inherited advantages carried responsibility to previous generations, that gratitude was expressed through actions rather than assumptions. These were lessons Dorothy had tried to teach Brian through endless patience and unconditional love. Standing on the ship's deck as Greek islands disappeared into evening twilight, I felt Dorothy's presence more strongly than I had since her death, not as absence or loss, but as approval and companionship. She would have celebrated this journey, would have cherished each sunset and ancient ruin and cultural discovery. Her memory had made the adventure possible. Her values had guided my decisions. Her love continued motivating choices that honored rather than enabled. The return flight to Portland would land tomorrow, bringing me home to a house that no longer carried the weight of Brian's endless crises, to a bank account that reflected personal priorities rather than family obligations, to a future built on foundation of respect rather than resentment.
Paul would continue hosting family gatherings at the cabin. Ruth would manage Dorothy's charitable legacy. Educational foundations would multiply the impact of her lifelong commitment to children's development. Brian would learn to build his own legacy through choices that demonstrated character rather than inheritance that bypassed accountability. His daughter would grow up understanding that family wealth was earned through family loyalty, that respect was reciprocal rather than automatic, that some lessons could only be learned through natural consequences rather than protective intervention. The Mediterranean stars reflected off calm waters as our ship sailed toward its final destination.
Tomorrow would begin the next chapter of a life no longer defined by enabling someone who'd never learned to value what he'd been given. Dorothy's dreams had become my adventures. Her hopes had transformed into others' opportunities. Her love continued flowing toward people who honored it through their actions. Some inheritances, I'd learned, were too precious to waste on people who'd never earned them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.